America. And so for today, we're going to take a look at race relations in the 20th century. Now, we're going to begin with the Progressive Era. This was a period in American history that lasted from 1890 to 1920. And when you think of progressive, you probably think of things that are democratic, that are forward-looking. And in fact, the Progressive Era was a period of social and political reform. But while this era is usually associated with journalists exposing the evils of monopolies, the period is also notable for the violence committed against Blacks throughout the country during this so-called Progressive Era. It was a time of vicious state-sponsored racism. In fact, from the standpoint of African-American history, the Progressive Era qualifies as arguably the single worst period for Blacks since emancipation. The wholesale disenfranchisement of Southern Black voters occurred during the years of the Progressive Era, and so did legalized segregation that resulted from the Supreme Court decision Plessy versus Ferguson. This was in 1896, and in this decision, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of laws that segregated the races. And the argument was that Black and white facilities should be separate, but it is constitutional because they are equal, when in fact, they were anything but equal. But Plessy versus Ferguson, this Supreme Court decision legalized Jim Crow segregation for the next 50 years. It was during the Progressive Era that popular book titles included Charles Carroll's The Negro, a Beast, and R.W. Schutfeldt's The Negro, a Menace to American Civilization. These books came out in the first decade of the 20th century. President Theodore Roosevelt, who was really the first progressive president, is sometimes praised for inviting Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House, the first African-American to dine at the White House. But that sparked an extreme protest from Southern congressmen. And so Teddy Roosevelt never invited a Black person to the White House again. Roosevelt also opposed voting rights for African-American, and even though voting rights were guaranteed by the 15th Amendment, but Teddy Roosevelt said that the Black race was still in its adolescence and therefore was not mature enough to gain the right to vote. And with his ingrained belief in the superiority of the so-called American race, he referred to Native Americans as savages and Blacks as entirely unfit for the suffrage. And it was during his administration that an incident broke out in Brownsville, Texas. It was known as the Brownsville Affair. This arose out of tensions between Black soldiers and white citizens in Brownsville, Texas in 1906. The townspeople accused the members of the all-Black 25th Regiment of killing a white bartender and a white policeman. And that resulted in riots in Brownsville, where a number of these Black soldiers were killed. And despite a lack of evidence, President Roosevelt ordered the dishonorable discharge of 167 soldiers of the 25th Regiment. And that dishonorable discharge caused them pensions and prevented them from serving in civil service jobs. Well, when Teddy Roosevelt ran for president again, the Black community remembered Brownsville. And so this poster was sort of a message to Black Americans not to vote for Teddy Roosevelt. A renewed investigation of the Brownsville Affair in the early 1970s proved that the men were innocent. The government then pardoned them and restored their records to show honorable discharges, but it didn't provide compensation to the survivors and descendants of those Black soldiers. Woodrow Wilson, yet another progressive president, imposed full racial segregation of all Black federal employees. Wilson was born in Virginia, and as president, he praised the film by D.W. Griffith, Birth of a Nation, which presented a version of American history that resonated with the white audience. Last week, we spoke about the way slavery was depicted in textbooks and this lost cause narrative. Well, the Birth of a Nation film depicted Reconstruction as the darkest chapter in American history, a time when Negroes ruled the South, as according to this film. And the movie extolled the Ku Klux Klan for defending the honor of white women against Black sexual predators. This was clearly a racist film, yet President Wilson supposedly said that it was as writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it's all so terribly true. This coming from a president who had a PhD in history, I'm very sorry to say. Birth of a Nation was the first motion picture to be shown at the White House, and it was one of the great box office successes of all time. The film is also credited as one of the events which inspired the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan. Wilson, who was once president of Princeton University, has been memorialized on the campus of Princeton, but recently students have protested buildings that were named after him because of Wilson's racist attitudes. Now, one of the developments in the early part of the 20th century was the Great Migration of Blacks out of the South. Although the single largest Black migration from the rural South to the North occurred during World War I, the process actually began towards the end of the 19th century, as many Southern Blacks sought to escape poverty, debt, violence, and oppression that they faced in the Jim Crow South. In 1900, more than 2/3 of the 10 million African Americans in the United States lived in the South. Most were sharecroppers and tenant farmers. Whether rural or urban, Southern Blacks faced limited employment opportunities, as well as poverty and racial discrimination and lynchings. And so from 1890 to 1910, some 200,000 African Americans left the South, and then even more left during World War I. So this map shows the direction. The yellow arrows are where Blacks moved, from the South to northeastern states, and this dark blue shows Blacks moving from the South to the Midwest, and the lighter blue to the far west. In 1910, 3 out of every 4 Black Americans lived on farms, and 9 out of 10 lived in the South. But World War I changed all that. Approximately 500,000 Blacks trekked northwards during the war. Chicago's population Black population grew by 148%. Cleveland's Black population tripled, and Detroit's increased 6-fold. Between 1914 and 1930, more than 1.5 million Blacks migrated out of the South. And if you would like to know more about this great migration, I strongly recommend this book, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. The entry of the United States into World War I in April of 1917 impacted racial thinking in America. The label Teutonic, which had been highly exalted in the United States, along with Anglo-Saxons, now Teutonic became a word of contempt. It was equated with the Hun, with the barbarian, which Germans were accused of. It was now taken for granted that the racial character of Germans was that of a murderous aggressor, whereas Anglo-Saxons were defenders of civilization. During World War I, IQ tests were used for the first time to evaluate and assign Army recruits to appropriate tasks. And one result was to show that the children of bank presidents and lawyers and college professors generally did much better than the children of workers, minorities, and immigrants. But rather than ascribing the results to the fortunate effect of a good environment, eugenicists argued that the test proved the importance of good heredity in the struggle for success, that those scoring lowest on the IQ test scored low because of their genetic makeup. Now, when the United States entered the war, most Black leaders viewed the conflict, World War I, as an opportunity for African Americans to prove their loyalty to the United States and to further their struggle for equal rights. More than 2 million Blacks registered for the draft, and that represented 13% of all draftees. Some 400,000 Black soldiers served during World War I, and a higher proportion of Black soldiers than white soldiers lost their lives in the war. They were made to fight in segregated units. Some 200,000 Black soldiers were sent to France during the war, and 40,000 saw combat. And they suffered extreme racism in the American armed forces and were relegated to these segregated units. Nevertheless, Black soldiers returned from the war with a new sense of pride, and they believed that their sacrifice would be repaid when the war was over, that America would be grateful for their service and grant more rights to African Americans. But that was not to be. The federal government denied Black soldiers the right to participate in the Victory March down the Champs-Élysées in Paris, even though Black troops from European colonies participated in the march through the Arc of Triumph. 10 African-American soldiers were among the 70 Blacks who were lynched in 1919, and 25 African-American soldiers were killed in the riots of 1919. Now, Black workers who had begun to move north competed with whites in northern cities for housing, for factory jobs. And that competition resulted in some of the most vicious racial violence in American history. In July of 1917, in East St. Louis, whites killed at least 40 Blacks and perhaps many more. And here is a cartoon of a Black mother shielding her children, begging President Wilson, who claimed that the United States was fighting to make the world safe for democracy. And the caption reads, "Mr. President, why not make America safe for democracy?" And in the background are flames in East St. Louis. In Chicago in 1919, when a young Black wandered into the White Beach on Lake Michigan, he was killed by a stone thrown from a group of whites. In the course of the next 5 days, 23 Blacks and 15 whites were murdered. 500 were injured, and millions of dollars in property was destroyed. There were also riots in Knoxville, Tennessee in August of 1919 and in Omaha, Nebraska in September of 1919. The city of Tulsa, Oklahoma was about 12% Black, and it had the most prosperous African-American business community in the United States. Booker T. Washington referred to that community as the Black Wall Street. But the strained relationship between the white and Black communities in Tulsa heightened jealousy on the part of whites towards these very successful Blacks. And that led to the Tulsa Race Riot. In 1921, a white elevator operator claimed that a Black man had attacked her. That man was arrested, but white residents set homes on fire and vandalized Black-owned businesses. Armed white men looted, burned, and destroyed the entire Black community of Tulsa. When the smoke cleared, there were merely shells of buildings left. 40 city blocks were leveled. Now, this is not a photograph of Hiroshima. This is a photograph of the results of the Tulsa Race Riot. African-American churches and 1,000 homes and businesses were destroyed. The official death count was 39, but more recent estimates of Black fatalities have been in the hundreds. The event of the riot was omitted from local and state history. In fact, I'm sure that none of you learned about this when you were in school. It was rarely mentioned in history books, and Blacks and whites alike grew to middle age unaware of what took place in Tulsa in 1921. In fact, it wasn't until 2001 that the state of Oklahoma officially acknowledged the riots and offered compensation to the descendants of the victims. The Tulsa riot stands out as the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. Now, I mentioned that the film Birth of a Nation helped lead to the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan. By the 1920s, the Klan, as you can see here, was marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. And you might notice that they were no longer masked. So what does that tell us? It tells us that they were not afraid of any reprisals. And so the Klan, an organization that stressed the supremacy of the white so-called Nordic race, targeted Blacks, Jews, and Catholics. But the proponents of racism were not only limited to the bigots of the Ku Klux Klan. Many prominent scientists and social scientists were convinced that the races vary greatly in innate intelligence and temperament. A historian and eugenicist by the name of Dr. Lothrop Stoddard warned that the Nordics in America were in danger of being inundated by inferior races that had higher birth rates than the Nordics. And so Stoddard was a vociferous advocate of restricting immigration, because during this period, there were millions of immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. In 1922, then Vice President Calvin Coolidge also argued that the Nordic race would deteriorate when it mixed with other races. Local eugenic societies sprang up around the United States after the war with names like the Race Betterment Foundation. At state fairs and exhibitions, eugenicists spread the word and hosted Fitter Family and Better Baby competitions to award blue ribbons to the finest of the human stock, not unlike awards given for prize bulls and for the biggest pumpkin. Margaret Sanger, the woman who launched the birth control movement in America, was an ardent, self-confessed eugenicist. she referred to the lower classes as human waste. She said, more children from the fit, less from the unfit. That is the chief aim of birth control. So the purpose of birth control, according to Margaret Sanger, was to limit the number of children born from the unfit, the human waste that she referred to. She argued that it would be better to let the unfit die so that eugenically superior strains could flourish and dominate. To Margaret Sanger, the lower classes were human weeds that should be exterminated. Now, that's not something that most people associate with Margaret Sanger. And these racist ideas led Congress to pass the Immigration Quota Act of 1924, which limited the number of immigrants coming from countries that eugenicists said had inferior stock. The law particularly limited immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and from Asia. It was also in the 1920s that anti-Semitism became a significant phenomenon in the United States. Henry Ford was the most prominent anti-Semite of the decade and the most admired man in America. In his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, among other things, he said, the Jew is a race that has no civilization to point to, even though Jews date back almost 5,000 years in history. No aspiring religion, no great achievement in any realm. He proclaimed that the founding fathers were men of the Anglo-Saxon race and that Jews represented a threat to America. He accused Jews of everything from world financial domination to fixing baseball games. And so quotas were imposed against Jews entering colleges, and employment ads would caution Hebrews need not apply. Now, although the Klan had declined by the late 1920s, the 1930s was a turbulent decade for race relations in America. The Great Depression was catastrophic for all workers, but as usual, Blacks suffered the worst. This is a rather ironic photograph of Blacks lined up at a soup kitchen in front of a billboard that proclaims America having the world's highest standard of living. Blacks were pushed out of unskilled jobs that previously whites would never take. But now with the Depression and unemployment on the rise, whites began replacing Blacks in unskilled jobs. And so Blacks faced unemployment 50% higher than unemployment for whites. And Black wages were at least 30% below those of white workers, who themselves were barely at subsistence levels in the 1930s. Even FDR's New Deal contained racist elements. As a leader of a political party that was heavily represented in Congress by racist Southern Democrats, FDR had to choose his battles carefully, and at times he appeared timid in the face of racial injustice. And so, New Deal public work projects rarely employed Blacks, and they maintained racist wage differentials when they did employ Blacks. The work of the Federal Housing Administration served to build rather than break down the walls of segregation. Blacks were excluded from participation in programs such as Social Security, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Tennessee Valley Authority, among others. And in 1937, Southern Democrats filibustered in order to defeat a federal anti-lynching bill. In fact, even today, there is no federal anti-lynching law. One of the worst manifestations of racism in the 1930s was the infamous Tuskegee medical experiment, which has a direct bearing on why some African Americans today refuse the COVID vaccine. Beginning in the early 1930s, public health care workers withheld treatment for hundreds of unsuspecting Black men who were infected with syphilis. Why? They wanted to research the course of the disease, but they told the men that they were being treated. And so, because in fact they were not, at least 28 men died and others transmitted the disease to their wives and children. More than several generations would pass before these experiments would end. It didn't end until 1972, and only after a news report exposed the study. This exposure eventually resulted in medical research reform, a presidential public apology, and a financial settlement. But the legacy of the study has sown distrust of medical institutions among many African Americans, some of whom refuse to take the COVID vaccine, and they cite the Tuskegee study as the reason for their reluctance. But the 1930s also witnessed the demise of the eugenics movement in America, thanks to anthropologists such as Franz Boas, who explained that mental and temperamental characteristics on the base of race was invalid. If we were to select the most intelligent, imaginative, energetic, and emotionally stable third of mankind, then all races would be present, said Boas. And increasingly, psychologists became aware of the extent to which IQ tests reflected the ideals and standards of a particular culture. But it was really the excesses of Nazi Germany that stemmed the tide of the eugenics movement in America. Most Americans were horrified by the Holocaust, which they recognized was the consequence of misguided racial ideology. Thereafter, what was once accepted as racial science, eugenics, it was exposed as nothing more than mere prejudice. Now, during World War II, the United States was forced to face the hypocrisy of fighting racist fascism abroad while tolerating racial injustice at home. The South was still strictly segregated, with Black Americans denied civil rights and prevented from voting. And America still fought the war with a segregated military. In many ways, World War II was a race war. It exposed raw prejudices and stereotypes that were fueled by arrogance and by racial pride. Distorted perception and unrestrained violence occurred on all sides in the war. Racial stereotypes, ideas of racial superiority and inferiority permeated both the Axis powers as well as the Allied powers. US servicemen had deep-seated fears and hatred of the Japanese, much more so than of Germans. These fears and hatred were fueled by Allied propaganda that dehumanized the Japanese enemy. Movies, music, and literature promoted the idea that the Japanese were not quite human, as you see in these posters. So while fighting racist fascism overseas, racial intolerance continued at home in the United States. In 1943, in Los Angeles, the Zoot Suit Riot broke out, in which Latino Americans were attacked for their clothing attire, the Zoot Suit. And the city of Los Angeles ultimately passed a law banning the Zoot Suit within the confines of the city of Los Angeles. And Soon after the United States entered the war, 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of whom were American citizens, were rounded up and placed in relocation camps throughout the United States. And racial discrimination continued throughout the war. German prisoners of war who were brought to the United States were served in white diners in the South, while Black GIs were refused service. Now, to me, that is the most definitive statement of racism in America. Think about that. African-American soldiers were fighting against Nazi soldiers in Europe. But when some of those Nazi soldiers were brought to POW camps in the American South, they would be served in diners that would refuse to serve the African-American soldiers. Blacks were hired in wartime factories, but at wages significantly lower than their white counterparts. And racial tensions were high in overcrowded American cities, particularly in those cities that attracted Blacks and poor whites from the South. Chicago, Detroit, Mobile, and Harlem all experienced race riots in 1943. The race riot in Detroit killed 25 Blacks and 9 whites, leaving 800 injured. It started when a group of Blacks started moving into housing developments built for them. And a mob of whites gathered, demanding housing for themselves, and they attacked the Blacks. The Harlem riot was started by a false rumor that a policeman killed a Black GI. The result was 6 dead, 543 injured, and $6 million in damages. And such incidents cast a blight on the pretensions of a nation supposedly fighting a world war for democratic ideals. But there were also some hopeful signs. Some Black airmen finally had the chance to fly. They were known as the Tuskegee Airmen. Black soldiers served with distinction in increasing numbers. A. Philip Randolph, the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, threatened a march on Washington in order to pressure President Franklin Roosevelt to end discrimination in federal hiring practices. And that threat of marching on Washington pressured Roosevelt to issue Executive Order 8802, which prohibited discrimination in the defense industry, in defense plants that received government contracts. The order also created a Fair Employment Practices Committee to investigate complaints about discrimination and to take appropriate action. So that was a positive development. The Double V campaign, promoted by the Pittsburgh Courier, the largest Black newspaper in America, called for victory abroad against fascism and victory at home against racism. Meanwhile, Black students at Howard University in Washington, D.C. picketed segregated restaurants. And those efforts foreshadowed the protest campaigns of the subsequent civil rights movement in the 1960s. By 1947, Jackie Robinson became the first Black in Major League Baseball since Moses Fleet Walker in the 1880s. And in 1948, President Truman issued Executive Order 9981 to desegregate the armed forces. And as I mentioned, the Holocaust made Americans aware of the horrors of racism and anti-Semitism. And after more than half a century of increasing animosity towards Jews in the United States, anti-Semitism suddenly began to decline after World War II. It was no longer socially acceptable. It was no longer mainstream. And so the Oscar for the Best Picture in 1947 went to Gentleman's Agreement, a film that unmasked those who try to hide their bigotry under the guise of gentility and conformity. Now we're going to get to the 1950s. In June 1953, the Black community of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, launched a mass boycott against segregated buses. And that really marked the direct action phase of the civil rights movement. Now, very few people think about Baton Rouge when it comes to the bus boycott. Generally, we think about the Montgomery bus boycott. But 4 years before the Montgomery, or 3 years before the Montgomery bus boycott, there was a bus boycott in Baton Rouge. And it lasted for 7 days, and it was highly successful. It galvanized the Black community of Baton Rouge. The New York Times reported that at least 90% of the Black population participated in the boycott. News of the success of this direct action grassroots strategy reverberated throughout Black churches across the South. Right here in California, in the city of Westminster, before the 1954 Brown decision, there was a case called Mendes versus Westminster in 1947, when a Mexican-American sued the Westminster public schools in order to get his daughter admitted to an all-white school. In 1947, the California State Supreme Court ruled that separate could never be considered equal. And 7 years before the Brown decision, all schools in California were desegregated. The governor of California at the time was Earl Warren, who would become the Supreme Court Chief Justice in the Brown case. In April of 1951, students at the all-Black Morton High School in Prince Edward County, Virginia, staged a walkout in protest against racial segregation. Barbara Johns was a 16-year-old student who led this walkout. The NAACP filed suit to desegregate Virginia schools. A federal district court turned down the suit, and so the NAACP appealed. And so the Brown versus Board of Education was only one of several cases that demanded the end of segregation. 5 different cases were folded into one, and that became the Brown versus Board of Ed case. And the Supreme Court decided in that case that the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision was overruled. The Brown decision said that segregation in schools was unconstitutional, that separate schools are inherently unequal. It further declared that racial segregation in public schools violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And the court then demanded that the states desegregate their schools, quote, with all deliberate speed. But Southern state governments engaged in massive resistance by choosing not to desegregate their schools and by denying funding to districts that attempted to desegregate. State legislatures in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Virginia adopted resolutions that declared the court's decision in the Brown case to be null, void, and of no effect. Now, a state does not have the right to declare a Supreme Court decision null, void, and to no effect. Nevertheless, that's what they did. And racial violence continued with the brutal death of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old Black boy who was murdered for allegedly flirting with a white woman in Money, Mississippi in 1955. And the President of the United States at the time, Dwight Eisenhower, had no desire to become a crusader for civil rights. When discussing the issue of segregation, he told Earl Warren he could understand why Southerners wanted to make sure, quote, their sweet little girls are not required to sit in school alongside some big Black buck. A direct quote from the President of the United States. Eisenhower refused to force Southern states to comply with the court's decision in the Brown case. Eisenhower argued that you cannot change people's hearts and minds by changing laws. But when Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus openly refused to allow Blacks to enter Little Rock Central High School, Eisenhower sent federal troops to ensure that the court order would be obeyed. He later said that his decision to send federal troops to Little Rock was his most repugnant act in all his 8 years in the White House. The Brown decision sparked challenges to other forms of discrimination in the South. In December 1955, Martin Luther King Jr., inspired by the philosophy of nonviolent civil disobedience, led the successful Montgomery bus boycott. In 1956, the Supreme Court upheld a lower court's decision outlawing segregation on buses. In February of 1960, 4 freshmen from the all-Black North Carolina A&T College sat down at the Woolworth lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, vowing to stay until the management agreed to desegregate it. Well, no one served them, and the store closed a half hour early. But eventually, lunch counter sit-ins took place across the entire state, as well as in other states in the South. And so the sit-in eventually became a vital tactic for civil rights protesters. A new organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, grew out of these sit-ins. So when historians evaluate the Eisenhower presidency, they give him very low marks when it comes to civil rights. He had no intention to get involved in the fight for integration, and he did not vigorously pursue the cause of civil rights for Blacks, as you can see in this cartoon, where he is portrayed as a fire chief, and there's a fire labeled the Civil Rights Crisis. But instead of putting out the fire, he turns to Uncle Sam and says, "Tisk, tisk, somebody should do something about that." But it certainly wasn't going to be him. Eisenhower was always comfortable with Southern segregationists and with segregation in the armed forces. Concerning the Brown decision, he later described his choice of Earl Warren as Supreme Court Chief Justice, quote, "the biggest damn fool mistake I ever made." Eisenhower was afraid of people like Martin Luther King Jr., who Eisenhower felt promoted racial ferment. Whatever concern he did have over the treatment of Blacks had more to do with the Cold War than with anything else. Eisenhower and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover were concerned with how the Soviet Union was using the issue of racism in their anti-American propaganda. The Little Rock case and the Montgomery bus boycott occurred around the same time that the Soviets launched Sputnik. And then the Soviets poured salt on the wound of American racism by pointing out that Sputnik regularly flies over Little Rock several times a day. Historians regard Eisenhower's grudging response to the profound moral issue of racial equality as the greatest failure of his presidency. By the end of the 1950s, the civil rights movement was about to enter its second phase, in which the demand for political and economic equality would grow increasingly militant. And the civil rights movement featured freedom riders going to the South to try to enroll people in voter registration. But that caused a sudden backlash. Some Southerners burned these buses, and 4 Black girls were killed in a bomb explosion in a church in Birmingham. Lyndon Johnson was one of the most complicated individuals ever to preside over the nation. He privately demeaned Blacks with the N-word. And for 2 decades in Congress, he was a reliable member of the Southern Bloc, helping to stonewall civil rights legislation. The civil rights bill that President Kennedy proposed had languished in Congress at the time of his assassination. But when Johnson became president, he made the bold and exceedingly risky decision to champion the Civil Rights Bill. He saw how to leverage the nation's grief by tying Kennedy's legacy to the fight against inequality. He met with congressmen, he twisted arms, he bent their ears, he cajoled them, he promised favors, and he threatened sanctions. And all of that pressure paid off early in 1964 when the measure mustered the necessary 2/3 majority in the Senate in order to end a filibuster by Southern senators. And the result was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed racial segregation in schools, public places, and employment. In the summer of 1964, civil rights leaders then shifted their focus to voting rights. During that summer, thousands of young Americans, Black and white, Northerners and Southerners, worked on behalf of Black voter registration and Black voter participation. The campaign was known as Freedom Summer, but it produced a violent response from some Southerners. 3 civil rights workers, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner, were murdered in Philadelphia, Mississippi. That murder was aided and abetted by local law officials. In March of 1965, Martin Luther King organized a march in Selma, Alabama to press for the rights of Blacks to register to vote. The demonstrators were then brutally attacked by local police, and that attack was televised nationally. It was also where John Lewis was severely beaten, suffering a fractured skull after crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The violent attacks were recorded and disseminated throughout the country, and these brutal images proved too powerful to ignore. The resulting widespread national outrage following these events on Bloody Sunday, as it was called, helped to push LBJ to propose and win passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that provided federal protection to African Americans attempting to exercise their 15th Amendment right to vote. And with the passage of these 2 laws, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, historians credit Lyndon Johnson as one of the most important figures in the civil rights movement. Some of his detractors characterized Johnson as a cynical racist, an unscrupulous politician, a vulgar wheeler-dealer who used the civil rights issue only when he realized the value of the Black vote. But Johnson's racism should not overshadow the fact that he championed landmark civil rights bills that formally ended apartheid in the United States, knowing that it would end any support for the Democratic Party throughout the South. From that point on, the South has voted solidly Republican, with the one exception of Jimmy Carter's 1976 campaign, because Carter was from Georgia. Now, while the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 certainly represented important gains in the struggle for racial equality, they failed to satisfy the demand of Black Americans on economic issues. By 1966, economic conditions in poor urban Black communities were deteriorating. More than half of all non-white Americans lived in poverty by the middle of the 1960s. The promise of Johnson's Great Society seemed distant and irrelevant to the difficulty of everyday life on streets in some American cities. And so despite the gains in public accommodations and voting rights, many Blacks still lived in crumbling inner cities. They attended substandard schools. They were harassed by white policemen, and they worked at subsistence wages if they were fortunate to have a job at all. And those pent-up frustrations exploded after the assassination of Martin Luther King in April of 1967. The riots, or insurrections or uprisings, as some have labeled it, These were sparked by long-standing anger and frustration over police brutality, over a sense of hopelessness about unemployment, poverty, low rates of Black home ownership, poor social services. And so in 1966, as you can see, there were riots in Chicago, Cleveland, Omaha, and in Michigan. More in 1967 and even more in 1968. But sadly, most of the same issues that plagued Black communities in the 1960s remain today. Despite President Johnson's programs to lessen racial inequality, progress in the view of many Black Americans was proceeding too slowly, and they were in no mood to be patient any longer. Now, what usually ignited the powder keg of resentment was police brutality. The first explosion occurred in Watts, here in California, in August of 1965, when a Black motorist was arrested for drunk driving. In the summer of 1966, there were 43 additional outbreaks, the most serious in Chicago and Cleveland. In 1967, there were more than 100 incidents, the largest in Detroit, where 43 people died. More intense rioting erupted in 1968 in more than 100 cities following the assassination of Martin Luther King. And so that was the state of race relations when Richard Nixon was elected president in 1968. And that's where we're going to pick up next week. So at this point, we will